When we hear the word barbarian, we usually think of savage tribes. In noisy hordes with swords in hand and no manners. But, curiously, that word was not born to describe warriors from Northern Europe, but to anyone who did not speak Greek. Yes, the Greeks were that exclusive. For the ancient Greeks, civilization was synonymous with speaking their language. Follow their lifestyle and, of course, appreciate their philosophy, their art, and their rationality. If you didn't speak Greek, your words sounded like a bar, hence the term barbaros. A somewhat mocking way of imitating what they considered foreign gibberish. So the word barbarian did not necessarily imply savagery, but rather being a foreigner, being the other, someone who does not belong to the refined world of Hellas. Now, this concept did not arise just on a whim. The Greeks had developed a very deep sense of cultural identity. They had organized city-states, theaters where philosophical ideas were discussed, mathematicians who measured the earth, and thinkers who questioned the universe. For them, civilization was something to be thought about, discussed, and polished like a sculpture. And of course, when they looked into that mirror of sophistication, they couldn't help but see the rest of the world as, well, less. That included many peoples we consider formidable civilizations today. But for the Greeks, if they did not speak their language or follow their way of life, they were not civilized. And the Romans, in their early days, fitted squarely into that category. Before becoming the imposing empire we know, Rome was seen by the Greeks as a rustic and militaristic city, more focused on strength and discipline than on philosophical reflection or artistic beauty. For the Greeks, those Romans were workers, yes, but crude, organized, but lacking in refined taste, and above all, they spoke Latin, a language that to Greek ears sounded as harsh as a shield scraping the ground. In short, the Greeks saw themselves as the guardians of knowledge, the founders of logic, the owners of good taste. So no matter how efficient the Romans were, for the Greeks, they were barbarians in tunics. For centuries, the Greeks were accustomed to looking at the world with a certain condescension. For them, the Persians were despotic, the Egyptians mysterious, and the northern peoples simple and crude. But then, from the Italian peninsula, a new actor began to emerge in the history of the Mediterranean, the Romans. The first serious contact between Greeks and Romans was not in a debate hall or a symposium with diluted wine. It was on the battlefield. During the Pyrrhic Wars. At the beginning of the 3rd century BC, the Romans faced King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a Hellenist educated in the Greek tradition, but also a skilled general. Pyrrhus was surprised by the Romans. On the one hand, he admired her tenacity and courage. But on the other hand, he considered them completely barbaric. The Romans did not retreat honorably, they did not negotiate diplomatically, and they did not understand the subtleties of Hellenistic warfare. They fought with an almost mechanical, implacable ferocity. And although they suffered many casualties, they raised armies with unbreakable discipline. In fact, it was Pyrrhus who said a famous phrase after a costly victory: "Another victory like this, and I'll be lost." The famous Pyrrhic victory, which bears his name. For the Greeks, the behavior of the Romans was almost alien. Brutally practical, without aesthetic sense, without the courtesy of the Hellenic kings, without interest in philosophy or beauty. To top it all off, they didn't even admire the arts as they should. How could they respect a people who built roads and aqueducts, but not theaters or academies? The Greeks saw the Romans as a kind of engineering people with the soul of a soldier, organized, efficient, but lacking in sensitivity. The old-fashioned equivalent of saying, hard workers, but lacking culture. It was the clash between two opposing mentalities. The Greeks, intellectuals, idealists, lovers of the abstract. The Romans, practical, disciplined, oriented towards power and utility. But here comes the curious part: the Romans also viewed the Greeks with a certain amount of suspicion. They seemed refined, yes, but also lazy, talkative, and untrustworthy. Admiration would come later, but in these first encounters, both peoples saw each other as a reflection of what they did not want to be. For the Greeks, Rome was a barbarian power in a cape. And for the Romans, Greece was a brilliant, but decadent culture. That mutual perception was soon to change, when Rome, little by little, began not only to conquer Greek lands, but to absorb their culture as an empire that not only kept the territory, but with everything he could take advantage of. An empire ended up doing what many barbarians never dreamed of: conquer Greece. They not only dominated its territories, but they took the big cities. They dismantled their armies and reduced the proud heirs of Pericles, Socrates, and Alexander to vassals. On a military level, it was a total humiliation. But here comes the plot twist: Rome didn't destroy Greek culture, it absorbed it like a sponge. What's more, he surrendered to her. The Romans conquered Greece with swords, but the Greeks conquered Rome with ideas. And that's not a cliché, it's a brutal historical fact. The Roman elite began to send their children to study in Athens, to hire Greek tutors, to collect Hellenistic sculptures and quote Plato as if they had been born on the Acropolis. The most popular language in Rome? Greek. The Roman gods? Copies of the Greeks with Latin names. Imperial architecture? Inspired by Doric temples and columns. The emperor's favorite philosophers? Greeks, all of them. And it wasn't just superficial. Rome didn't just copy, it culturally reprogrammed itself. Their philosophy, their art, their education, and even their rhetoric, everything was Greekized. This is important. The same Greeks who called them barbarians. They ended up shaping the intellectual soul of the empire that had subjugated them. The military humiliation was compensated by such a complete cultural victory that Rome ended up looking more like Athens than it would ever admit. Even Cicero, one of the pillars of Roman culture, unashamedly stated that Greece, conquered its fierce victor. And that's where the irony becomes a lesson. The Romans arrived as rude pragmatists, but they ended up building a hybrid civilization, where Latin power and Greek thought coexisted in perfect balance, at least for a few centuries. When the Romans conquered Greece, they not only won militarily, but they absorbed its culture. What began as a Greek superiority in which Rome was seen as a rough and unrefined people, it ended with a profound transformation. Rome became the main custodian of the Greek legacy. The Romans' admiration for Greek culture was immediate and profound. Emperors like Hadrian rebuilt cities in the Hellenistic style, while Roman thinkers such as Cicero, Seneca, and Virgil were directly inspired by Greek philosophy, literature, and art. The Romans began to study Greek, not only as a language, but as the basis of higher education. Greek philosophical ideas, especially the teachings of Plato and Aristotle, became the backbone of Roman thought. And Roman philosophers such as Marcus Aurelius adopted Greek Stoicism as their life guide. In fact, Marcus Aurelius' meditations are written in Greek, not Latin. In the end, Rome not only took military power from Greece, but also preserved and expanded its intellectual and cultural legacy. Without Roman influence, many of the great Greek ideas would likely have been lost with the fall of their city-states. Thus, the barbarians not only conquered Greece, they made it their own and projected it into the future, merging Roman practical structure with Greek intellectual depth to shape what we know today as Western civilization.